Something that's closely related to map scale is the spatial resolution of data. So this relates to the level of spatial detail in a data set. Essentially, what is the smallest feature that is included in a data set. So both vector and raster data have spatial resolutions, although spatial resolution is typically more important of a consideration when working with raster data. So raster resolution is determined by the size of the grid cell. Now the grids are squares, so the width and the height of all the cells are the same. So we can just use one number to represent the raster resolution. So for instance, a 1 meter resolution image means that a cell is 1 meter by 1 meter, whereas an 8 meter resolution image means that it's 8 meters by 8 meters. So the resolution is directly determined by the size of the grid cell. And what that means is the higher the resolution, the smaller the cells, the finer grain or finer detail that you have in an image. So the 1 meter resolution shows a much finer resolution image, shows much more detail. You can actually make out landscape features, whereas an 8 meter resolution image is just, at least at this map scale, very grainy, and you can't pick out the features. So the same features can be collected at different levels of detail. That might depend on the sensors available to collect the information or the level of detail that we need the information at. So again, we call this the spatial resolution. Raster images with more pixels are said to have higher resolution, or more pixels per area are said to have higher resolution than those with fewer pixels in the same area. So the key point is that every pixel takes up the same amount of memory, regardless of its size. So if you want to represent a certain area, if you use more pixels or more cells to do that, it's going to take up more memory. But the trade-off is that you can represent the finer details of an object. So for instance, we have this actual object. It might be a kidney-shaped pool in someone's backyard. If we take this pool, which is 71 square meters, and we represent it using a grid of 1 meter by 1 meter cells. So we have 16 cells across and 16 cells up, each 1 meter long. That's going to create a domain of 16 meters by 16 meters. And so we'll end up using all these cells. We can represent the general outline of this pool quite well. Now you look at the area of that cell, so we end up with 73 separate cells representing this pool. The area is actually a bit of an overestimate, 73 square meters. And again, this is because we're taking the actual boundaries and we're simplifying them using cells to represent them. We can decrease the resolution a bit, go to 2 meter cells. And so again, the area is still pretty closely approximated. It actually is a little bit closer than the 1 meter cells. But the level of detail, the shape of the object is not as accurate. We can see that we still get the general shape of the pool, but you can't really tell that it's like a kidney-shaped pool anymore. And if you decrease the resolution even more to 4 meters by 4 meters, we see that the area estimation starts to get way farther away from the actual value. And the detail of this pool is not very good. You can't really make out that it's a kidney-shaped swimming pool anymore. So to recap, the resolution is determined by the size of the grid cell. Higher resolution equals smaller cells equals finer detail. And so what we have here is a trade-off between spatial accuracy and file size, and a trade-off between display and processing time. So it takes more space to save and store a very fine detail image, and it takes more time to process it when you're running tasks, overlays, for instance. However, it takes less time, it also takes more time to display it or draw it on a map. However, it takes less time to process and display and less memory to store if you represent things at a smaller cell size or a larger cell size. So a smaller resolution. So the trade-off here sometimes is determined by the specific type of instrument or sensor that you have access to. So for instance, in Lab 2, we're going to work with Landsat 8 data, which is satellite imagery collected by the Landsat 8 satellite. And this data has 30-meter resolution. So what that means is the cell is 30 meters by 30 meters. And that's the smallest feature that we can represent with this data. We can't look at anything smaller than that. And so in this case, the limiting factor is the satellite. But in other circumstances, you might just, maybe you don't need that much detail or that much resolution, or maybe you want the processing to happen faster. And so to build on the example of the pool, when using the raster data model, all of the detail within a single cell is lost. And so when we rasterize discrete objects, this can cause difficulties because it might be impossible to represent a certain feature depending on the size of the cell and the method we use to represent it. Also, once in raster format, it might be impossible to go back and determine the actual boundaries, only the cell boundaries. So for instance, imagine that this is a map representing snow cover. And so we have the actual snow cover boundaries on the top left. And then we have a raster that we're trying to use to represent this data of a certain resolution. And we can make, for instance, a choice about how we want to represent that data. Do we want to use the largest share rule, where a cell takes the value of the largest share of the area within it? So in this case, most of the cells have more snow-free area. If the white patch represents snow and the pink represents snow-free. 3 of the cells have more snow-free area than they have snow area. And so only the top left would represent snow. Or do we want to use the center point rule? So in this case, we would say we just take the value at the very middle of the cell, regardless of what the actual distribution is within it, and we take that as a value. Using this technique, we get a different map representing a different representation of snow cover. And so this is known as the mixed pixel problem. And so the mixed pixel problem is somewhat related to the resolution, but it will happen regardless of the resolution of the data that you're working with. And so we just have the question of how do we assign values to grid cells that contain more than one data type. So for instance, we have essentially 2 areas on this image. We have water and forest. And so how do we represent? Where it's all water or it's all forest, it's very straightforward, pretty easy to do. But there's different ways that we could go about representing it. We could create a new class to represent the edges because these are areas where there's mixed values. Or we could say any, depending on the question we're trying to ask, maybe we're interested in any area that has vegetation at all, then we would say any cell that has vegetation in it is going to be marked as vegetation. Or maybe we go with the majority rules, like this example in the example A. And in that case, you would say base it off the area within the cells. And so the mixed pixel problem comes up quite a bit when working with raster data. There's not really, again, a straightforward answer to it. It really depends on what you're trying to do and the circumstances you're working with. To recap, resolution is a property of the data. Scale is a property of the map. So for instance, here we're looking at the same raster image, the same data, at the same resolution, but at different scales. So on the left, the resolution is suitable for showing a crisp image of the full area of Metro Vancouver. But if we use this resolution data and zoom in to a different scale, we can see that then things start to look grainy. So again, the scale is the attribute of the map. What's the actual size we're looking at? So the one on the left, is a small scale map that's very zoomed out, and the one on the right is a large scale map, very zoomed in, but with the same scale. Now, vector data also has resolution, although it's not necessarily dictated by something like the capacity of a sensor, for instance. Instead, it's how many points are we using to represent a line or a polygon. And so The resolution is essentially determined by what's the smallest feature included in the data set, how precisely are the features delineated. So unlike raster data, where we can use just like one number, the cell size, to describe the resolution, it's a little more abstract to talk about the resolution of a vector data set. So for instance, you can see on the left side of this figure, we've got road layer represented by raster data at different resolutions. We have 5 by 5 grid, 10 by 10 grid, 20 by 20 grid. The corresponding equivalent of that with vector data would just be how many points are we going to use to represent the lines? How many points represent the roads? So do we only have points to represent where there's intersections or major turns? In which case we could represent this road layer with just 7 points. Or do we want to represent the curves in the road as it travels along a hillside or moves through a valley or something like that? In which case you can add more points to represent more curves on a line, and you'll then have higher resolution vector data. So again, resolution versus scale. Resolution is a property of data. Scale is a property of the map that you're making. So here, instead, we're showing the same scale. So we're zoomed in on the Georgia Strait with Metro Vancouver and the Gulf Islands and the Sunshine Coast. And so on the left, we have higher resolution vector data. We're using more points to represent the coastline. And on the right, we have lower resolution vector data. We're using fewer points to represent the coastline. But in this case, the map is at the same scale.